welcome back to The Accidental Writer at the Alex Cafe. My name is Susan Berg.
And my name is Dickie Gross. And today we're hitting double figures. 10 shows and we haven't even been scratched yet. This is an achievement.
It's only going to get better from here.
Yeah. Surprised it's not on the front page of the major newspapers, but it isn't. And I have to say, you haven't commented on my delicious new haircut.
Yeah. Can't say something nice, don't say anything at all.
Thank you. And our first person who we've got under the microscope is Anna George, who's written this great novel called Tipping. Tipping is about a woman who's reached a tipping point in her life, and it forces her to reevaluate her relationship with her family, the school her ungrateful brats go to, and it's a ripper read.
Next we have Andrew Griffith, who is an Australian author. He has hit the speaking circuit with people alongside him such as Richard Branson. He's also done a TED Talk and has written 14 books on how you can be better in business.
And finally we have Lish Skec, who's a performance poet. She's speaking to our poetry guru Hamo, or I should call him Hamish. And that's the show. On with the show. Double figures.
Anna, Tipping is your third novel. The first one was What Came Before, and the second one, The Lone Child. Tipping has actually got a totally different tone to it and is very relevant in today's current climate and with issues. Tell us a bit about the storyline.
Sure. Well, Tipping is a dark comedy set at a local school when one mum reaches tipping point, thanks largely to her husband, who inadvertently locks her in the family car, and one of her sons being involved in a sexism scandal that's connected to his school. So her fellow students have been putting his Instagram account up, and it's attracted a lot of attention because it's offensive. And this moment in my main character's life, Liv Winsome's life, makes her realise things need to change because her son's not understanding the consequences or the context of this sexting scandal. Her family is basically being run by herself. She carries the load of the family.
Like most mothers.
Like a lot of mums out there, and she realises she's had enough, and she goes on a campaign of change to rejig the structure of her family and the way the domestic load's split. And she also calls out the school on its response to this sexting scandal and asks it to have a look at itself through the lens of gender. Yeah.
So, look, I have to say, you and Kate Ellis are remarkably either prescient or is it serendipity? Who knows? But at the moment when the nation is absolutely dealing with these issues because of the atrocities in Parliament, this has been an extraordinary time for you to release a book on almost all of these issues.
Yeah, it's spooky timing really. But I did start writing this book 4 years ago, and actually I was going to write a sexual harassment story set at a school, and then Me Too happened. So I was before Me Too in the beginning of this book, and then I realised I couldn't really write another sexual harassment story when everyone in the world is tweeting their sexual harassment story. So I needed to come to the conversation in a different way, and I started thinking about schools and educating young people and young boys in particular about how to be rounded and respectful humans who are emotionally intelligent and emotionally literate. So I went to the school angle, and then I sort of started thinking about sexual harassment at the school level, at the student level, because we always think about harassment from an adult to a child maybe at a school, or we'd look at adult harassing, but I thought about teenage harassers, and then I began researching that and writing that. And it is uncanny that it came out right when Chanel...
Or is it the zeitgeist? Are you a seer?
Maybe. I mean, what came before was about domestic violence and domestic abuse, and that came out at a time when everything was blowing up. But these issues are around forever, right?
They're around forever, and they get oxygen and then they get, crowded out by other issues. I think gender violence now has been a real issue, attracting real governmental attention in Victoria. I can't talk for the rest of the nation, but really for a decade, and a lot of money's been spent and nothing's changed.
Well, the funny thing in my book, one, I've tried to make the book light, and I've introduced humour to add to this conversation in a different way. And also what really got me excited in the writing of the book was the learning about how things can change, because I wanted to create a school that needed to go through a cultural shift, but I didn't want to have a teacher that comes to the school and lectures people. I don't want to write a book of lectures, and I didn't want to create that Robin Williams character that touches the hearts and souls of one class and changes those kids. I wanted a whole culture change. And so I discovered, which is well known to lots of people, but behavioural design is this field whereby we can change behaviour without needing to change minds. I think one of the issues you've got with changing human behaviour is people are set in their thinking. We have lots of unconscious biases. You can, train people or lecture them, and it doesn't necessarily shift their behaviour. But in my book, using this idea of behavioural design as a means to show a story where culture really changes through interventions in the physical environment as well as in processes and practices. So you're changing the way things are done and how things are done and not what people think to get a behaviour change. One of the inspirations for my book was change that came about at Harvard Business School when it had a gender equality problem about a decade ago. In that really smart men and women from around the world would go to Harvard to do their MBAs. And after 2 years, the men left with the better grades, winning prizes that are awarded to the top 5% of students in greater numbers than the women, and actually having a better time at the school generally. And Harvard realised it had an issue and set about figuring out what the issue was more deeply, and analysed everything it did and took feedback from staff and students and alumni. And they found one of the facets to the problem was the gender grade gap could be attributed to classroom participation, because these men got better grades based on their classroom participation, and they found that was in part because they dominated the conversation. I think other factors came to play, like the young men were passing notes around about the women in the class as if they were 14, sexualising looks rating notes about the women. And sometimes when the women did participate, it wasn't recalled or remembered by the professors or the staff at front. And so they did a number of things to try and address this, and particularly on classroom participation. They put note takers in the back of every class to write down every single thing that was said and done. And that would be presented to the professors at the end of the course. They trained young women to step up more in class and how to raise their hands to get attention and to take up space in class, because the women, I think, would sort of do this when it was time to talk. So they were teaching them how to raise arms as if they were in preschool. They put a clamp on those passing of notes, and there were real consequences around the passing of notes around the women. And they broke the groups into smaller groups more often. And these are all kind of behavioural design interventions. They're changing how things are done. They're lecturing the students, but they're not just doing that, they're changing how they do things. And after the 2 year period, to people's surprise, the gender grade gap narrowed. Women winning those prizes at the end of the period in greater numbers than they ever had, and both men and women and even junior faculty women were having a better experience at the school because the culture of the school shifted. And now the gender grade gap's gone and the satisfaction gap has gone.
Moving on to the actual writing process, like how much of yourself and the people around you, maybe your own family, your friends, do you actually bring into a story? Like you were a lawyer before you were writing, and
Very Liv.
Very Liv, yeah. Lots and lots. I mean, in all different ways. I mean, for example, at the beginning of the book, my main character, Liv, gets locked in her car. One of my really best friends was locked in her car accidentally by her husband as he rushed off to coach basketball for one of their sons. And a passerby had to come and save her and get the husband out of the basketball stadium to free her from the car, which became a funny story because she obviously survived to tell it. But that was a great opening, I thought, for a novel to sum up how a mum can feel kind of forgotten and taken for granted, locked in the car by her husband. Other elements, I'm raising 2 teenage sons with my husband. The characters in this book have 3 sons, and then the other character is a mother of a daughter. And I absolutely mix up people I meet, bits and pieces, parts of myself, parts of my husband.
do you write down the list of what jobs around the family are to be done?
No, but that's just what my character does. She writes a really big list of everything that has to be done and delegates because she's doing all of it, mostly. But no, one of my friends years ago did do a mega list, and another woman, a work colleague friend of mine years ago, wrote a really big list of everything she did at work because I think she felt very taken for granted too. So the idea of just putting it down on paper and showing everyone created a moment for change because you sort of analysing what you're doing and saying, let's change this.
And I think that is a thing for mothers though, isn't it? That a lot of them feel that their role has been put into doing all the housework, looking after their kids, and it's not gender equality in relation to who does what around the house, and they can often feel taken for granted and that it all lays on their shoulders.
And I think you can fall into those roles, or you can have good intentions in the beginning to be fair, and then over time there's a drift and you end up doing more and more perhaps and not realising until you stop and say, do you realise what's happening now? I'm doing this and you're doing that and we need to correct it. Some people don't talk about it, some people do, but it's good to take fresh eyes to your life every so often, which is what the book's about as well, taking fresh eyes to the school, to the marriage, to the workplace where the husband goes to work as a lawyer.
Now, it takes place in a private school, not just any private school, they all seem monstrously wealthy. Yeah. We're all inverted snobs in Australia, and
that's not true. He's speaking from experience, for himself.
Well, there is nothing more vilified than, a Melbourne private school. So I thought it was an edgy decision to put it in that environment, because there are people who'd say, I don't give a toss.
I think a few things to that. First of all, my characters aren't all really wealthy. I mean, the school's very wealthy and there are wealthy people there, but I've got two families that I'm really focusing on. One, the girl's on a partial scholarship, they're not wealthy at all. And my main family with the three sons, they kind of cobble it together to keep their sons there. They've made a choice to do that. And I take your point, yes, there is a reverse snob element in society for sure, but look, this book was partly inspired by these schools, so I couldn't not set them there. One, a local school in Bayside where a couple of boys created a dodgy Instagram account, and that attracted a lot of attention in the community, and I was really fascinated by the parents reacted to that Instagram account. And then the next school was the school where there was an infamous haircut delivered by a deputy headmaster, which led to him losing his job. And then the schoolboys rallying around him and rallying around what they believed in and becoming activists. So that was really interesting. And yes, some people read those stories in the paper and thought, we don't care. But for me, it was people power. These boys became activists, and they campaigned for that man to have his job returned to him, which it did. It was returned. But also, the haircut was a tipping point for change, I think, at that school, because it brought to light the conflict between the old guard and the new guard at the school. And the old guard guy got his job back, and the relatively newer principal left quietly some months later. So I was fascinated by
Not that quietly, I think it made it to the front page of
Did it? Yeah,
The Age.
yeah. But they weren't protesting about it, were they?
No, he was a goner.
Yeah, but that was really, really interesting, because I'm interested in tipping points, in tweaks to create change in your life, and in the power of tipping points. And tipping points sometimes are brought about by a tweak. And so how change can happen, and it can happen dramatically and quickly, which is exciting in the gender equality context, because you've got behavioural design, you've got tweaks, and you've got tipping points. So change is actually possible.
Okay, well, thanks very much for coming in. I loved it. I still got 2 chapters to go to finish it, which I'll devour at the end of this, and congratulations for getting it out right on time.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on your program. Really fun.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Andrew, you've written 14 books on business. They've been published by Allen & Unwin, Simon & Schuster and Central Publishing. I'm really interested, though, that you've got such a fascinating personal story. Is that something you're going to look at sharing in a book one day?
Well, it has been shared in a book. The book that I wrote with Simon & Schuster is called The Me Myth, and that was all about the concept of it's not being self-indulgent, and when we make it less about us and more about other people, life becomes a little bit richer.
Oh, I hate that.
You hate the concept straight. I know, right? I know.
He needs a signed copy of that one, yeah.
But the Simon & Schuster initially asked me to write a memoir, and I just kind of felt it was a little bit too self-indulgent for me. I wasn't very comfortable, but I said what I'll do is I'll write a personal growth book, and I'll share my story.
Well, it is interesting with the memoir, because there's a bit of a wanker alert with that.
It can be.
But, some, including hers, are extraordinary stories that need to be told.
Absolutely, but I think you've got to be comfortable with where you're at to share it.
That's true. Memoirs are usually at the end of vocational life.
Yeah.
And
I'm not that old. Shh. I'm getting there. I hope to be old enough to be able to do that one day.
Yeah, it has that element of reflection. But I saw the TED Talk. Your early days were extraordinary.
Maybe you could share
cruel.
Some of that.
My sister and I were abandoned by our parents when I was about 6 months old. My sister was about a year old, and this was in Melbourne, ironically. We ended up, this is in the 60s, so the welfare system was far less structured than it perhaps is now. I don't know if it's a whole lot better, but it was less structured. We ended up being, this old lady took us in. She actually knew my parents, I think it was the connection there. But she was 74 years old, and she
hadn't had kids before.
She'd had her own kids, and they were kind of grown up. But it was all a very long and complex story. She also had dementia. She was very violent. Most of the time she didn't even really remember our names, but we lived in this very bizarre situation at an era where, again, just that stuff happened.
So I'm struck by your tale about how it is sort of the classic entry story narrative for dysfunction and criminality. It hasn't happened.
Oh no, it happened. Don't worry. That pathway is very predictable. When you for anyone who's experienced it, you automatically are attracted to the wrong side of town. You are automatically attracted to crime, drugs, alcohol, theft, all that stuff. And there's no doubt that was a pathway that I was
with an
heading.
internal narrative that's all okay.
You want to fit. You're angry. All of those kind of things come into play. I was just fortunate enough to be able to understand what I was doing and why I was doing it. And there's a big gap between 6 months and say 16 and everything that happened in there to my sister and to myself. But you go down that predictable path. But sometimes, if you're fortunate, you are able to perhaps go, right here, right now, I've got to make a decision. I either turn left or turn right, and I turned left instead of turning right. And it was a conscious decision. I knew what turning right meant. I knew where that was going. I knew everyone I was hanging. Everything was escalating. The drugs. You smoked a bit of dope when you're 10. All of a sudden, you're on cocaine. All of a sudden, you're on. You're stealing a car at 14. You're smoking heroin for the first time when you're 16. You start to move down that
path of
predictable
self-destruction.
Path, and anyone, it's almost so predictable it's cliched in some respects. And that's the path that I went down.
So how do you then come to be an expert in business and build yourself up and be the person you're not just an expert in helping people with this, you're a mentor as well, doing one-on-one work with people. So how did you build yourself, get up and really...
Well, it started, I bought my first business when I was like 17 or 18. And I don't really know where that came from because I had no entrepreneurial role models, as you can tell from that story. The closest I came to entrepreneurialism was selling drugs at school, right? Mostly to my teachers.
Well, that works for a lot of people.
Mostly to my teachers.
Make good teachers.
I didn't go to a very good school.
Wow.
I'm talking about that.
Wow.
This was in Sydney then, Asquith Boys High, which is a very, very rough school. And seriously, they were my best customers. So that was my entrepreneurial streak.
Wow.
But I ended up, I'd always dived. I'd somehow through my little life, I'd had a fascination with the ocean. I dived. I had a fantasy about being a marine biologist for a while and all this kind of stuff. But I ended up working in a dive shop and I ended up buying it from the guy who owned it for, stuff. In the 80s, when you could walk into a bank and just ask for, 20 grand or 30 grand or something, they just give you a check and you pat you on the head and you walk out. It was such a wonderful time, the 80s. That did start it, but then I went on and did a whole pile of other things. And I was a commercial diver by trade. I had a travel business. I worked in exploration.
So how did you get to your prodigious output of books?
Okay, down to that point. As a commercial diver, I was working in Cairns. I got decompression sickness. I was working for a Japanese company and they said, well, you can't dive anymore. I got a very bad case of decompression sickness, the bends.
Hurties?
So hurties or lotties. And Japanese company said, well, you can't dive anymore. We'll retrain you in sales and marketing. I kind of took to that really well, spent 5 years as their international sales and marketing manager, finished that, started my own little marketing company and realised that I love small business and I started getting all these clients that had all these problems that I could solve. I wrote a book called 101 Ways to Market Your Business. I approached Allen & Unwin, thinking no one's ever going to publish anything that I had because I was basically illiterate, I think. And they said, we love your book. They said, your writing is horrendous. Looks like your book has been written by a drunken, heroin-addicted chimpanzee, was basically the quote that they used. But we love your messages. We love your stories.
Was that your interpretation or was that actually what they
that's
said?
How I remember. No, it wasn't flattering, but it was really good because what they said to me was that we can fix bad writing, but we can't create great content. And you have great content. so as far as we're concerned, we're prepared to take a punt on you because we think your book is fabulous. And, serendipity. There weren't many Australian business writers. This is in 1999. There weren't many Australian small business writers. We're still getting all of our advice from England and from American authors.
And Koshy.
And Koshy. This might have even been before Koshy. No, nothing's before Koshy. So the first
BC.
book was published, and it was hugely successful. And then they said, "Well, do you want to write another one?" I went, "Sure." And I had 11 books that I published with Allen & Unwin, and every year I just wrote another book and they published it. And they sold. And it was only then that Simon & Schuster approached me and said, "We want to do your autobiography." And that's when I did the Me Myth in 2010, I think it was, around there. And then I started to do my own books. I had a few years off. It was too much of a writing schedule, to be honest, to write a book that's going to be commercially published every year. And I actually did 12 books in 11 years. It's actually a bit too much. But, publishers like you to be producing more.
Thank you so much for
You're
coming in
welcome,
and
Susan.
joining us today. Your latest book,
Which we didn't talk about.
No, we didn't, because
Doesn't
it was
matter.
too interesting talking about your life in
Doesn't
general.
matter.
Someone has to be the most expensive. Why not make it you? I want to go out and have coffee with you afterwards so that you can tell me how I can become the most expensive.
Deal.
And
Deal.
we'll all live happily ever after.
Well, you will.
I will. We don't know about Dick, but
Yeah, I've got another one. Someone has to be the cheapest. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, no, I'm completely,
thanks for coming
Cheap
in,
lad.
Andrew.
You're welcome.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Really nice to talk to you, mate. That was fun.
Thank you.
How are you today, Lish?
I'm good, Hamish. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's lovely to see you here at last. Lish, you've been active in the poetry and art scene in Melbourne for what seems to be 25 years or so?
Yeah.
As I understand it?
Yeah, about 25 years.
Yeah.
I started sneaking in to the Perseverance Hotel when I was 16, but I wasn't reading then, just to watch all the poets. And you'd see like Jazz H. Duke
Oh, yes,
and
yeah,
some
right.
really amazing
Yeah.
writers and things, and I found that very inspirational.
With your own poetry, when and how did you start writing poetry yourself?
Oh, when I was in grade 3 or grade 4, my mother gave me a book of poems, and it was a striped A5 school book of poetry that was hers, and it had the Highwayman and the Eagle and all of this wonderful poetry in it, including My Country. And I memorised it. I was like, oh, this is just magical. And you can tell a story with brevity, which was something that really appealed to me. And it was also romantic. So I actually think I started writing poetry, in primary school.
Right. Your performances have always been really animated and really, you really invoke a sense of wonder in poetry and a clear love of it. How do you regard things in Melbourne more recently?
I think a huge part of that is I'm not there anymore.
Right.
When I read my poems, that's where I've gone.
Right.
And I've always been that way. So, and I did a lot of theatre, I've done a lot of plays and a lot of acting and things like that. And I've just always been that way. So once I start reading something, I don't really notice the audience so much anymore. And I don't notice what's going on as much either, because I've become whatever it is that I'm performing at the time. And that's, I think, because I write with my own voice.
Right.
Which is something that not all poets do. You get to a point where you think, oh, this is topical, so I'm going to write a series of poems about this topic. Whereas I've never really done that, unless it's really spoken to me. Like it says, Bukowski would say a poem should rip out of you, or a piece of writing should rip out of you. And that's kind of the way that I work. So it could be weeks without me writing down a complete piece, maybe just a couple of lines here and there because I've thought of them. So by the time I've gotten to a piece, it's intense and just takes you over.
And you've always brought that energy and that intensity to your performances that I've seen. Yeah.
I remember other people's things. It's really frustrating. If I like something, I'll remember it like from beginning to end, and it'll ghost me during the day. And even now, if I see leaves on the ground, I hear Shelton Lee reciting it. So
indelible
it's kind of, sometimes
associations.
I stand, you know. So it's just, I can remember the entire Monkey Magic beginning by heart. Really ridiculous things because I've got a photographic memory as well. So there could be that too.
And it can be triggered by at unexpected times in unexpected places. You just don't know.
Exactly.
More recently, over the last couple of years, you've been convening an event called Poetry Spective at the Pride of our Footscray Community Bar. And you must be up to about number 81 or 82 of those events by now. But it seems to be quite a popular event, even the online version of it that's had to be broadcast during the pandemic.
It's really blossomed. I've been lucky in that, really. But I mean, obviously I've worked, but I think it's really good the way that it's expanded. And the strange thing is that it seemed to really bloom during COVID, during lockdown, because I had the online. I had the online fortnightly episodes on YouTube instead, which is now monthly, as well as the live gigs. So I think that had a huge impact because people were at home and they obviously couldn't go anywhere. So we had all these different people from Melbourne that usually wouldn't come as regularly to Poetry Spective contributing every fortnight. And then, of course, because it was on YouTube, I started getting interest from people in India and America and France and other countries, and they started contributing. So from that, it's really...
Yes, I noticed people that I'd never heard of or seen making appearances in Poetry Spective.
And also the retrospective.
The retrospective
was a key,
as well.
key element to that. There's a bit of self-indulgence, I think, at times in poetry.
Thank you very much for coming into the Alex Cafe today, and hopefully we'll meet again at an event very soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been wonderful. I run around my dream within myself, trying to rebuild my cervix with nails and wood. Touch translucent ovaries, checking their ripeness, the eggs, orange suns. I struggle with beams that fall into nothing. My tubes are too fibrous. I rip them apart. The red becomes redder. There's blood all around me. I'm naked, looking up at my heart. Its beat is irregular. I can't slow it down. I jump, fall into the dark.
Thanks for joining us today on our very first double-digit episode.
10, and we haven't been axed.
Yes, now we are 10.
Before we close off, we just want to have a quick chat with Hamish about the National Poetry Month that's coming up. Tell us a bit about it, Hamish.
Yeah, it's a Sydney-based poetry organisation, Red Room Poetry, who launched the idea a few weeks ago. Australia doesn't have a National Poetry Month like they do in either England or the United States. So they've announced that they're going to hold one all through August with some very exciting people and events involved, and there'll be more announcements about it soon.
Cool.
Good. So you'll be back with us to share more in the coming month or two.
Yep,
great.
Certainly.
Well, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.